Money and Macro talking about Gary Stevenson from Gary's Economics. I do want to see this reaction. It'll be a quick little video, and I'll be giving you my thoughts as they come up. And I think this guy, Macro, I'll be totally honest, or possibly Marco, I'm not really sure of his name. That guy, I like him a little bit more. He shows data, he shows charts. I don't see as much of that from Gary Stevenson. I've not watched his entire library of content. 100% completely fair. If he is, and every video that I've seen from him is just a weird outlier where he uses no numbers, totally possible. But I think this guy's a little bit better.
The last 70 years are not normal, Stephen. The last 70 years are not normal. The last 70 years in Europe and the US, where ordinary people like my dad could work for the post office on less than average wage and buy a house and support a family, it's not normal. It's not normal in the world, and it's not normal in history. Most countries in the world are not like that. Most countries have a small super rich elite and a very large group of extremely poor people. That's most of the country.
It's most of the country, it's most of the thing. And again, these are points that I brought up in his previous video where he was talking about economic collapse. And I think he does kind of miss the point here because he views history and economics in an odd way that's really kind of ahistorical. It's kind of true now, but he'll use this as a broad historical model, which is just not the case. Broadly, historically speaking, there were two groups. He says there's four. He's like, all right, there's a working class, there's a middle class, there's the government, and then there's the rich. That's not the case. Historically speaking, there was a working class, your peasants, your serfs, even the people that were like, skilled laborers and these types of things, your merchants. The majority of these people were all essentially working class because then you had the second class, which was the state / the aristocracy / the rich. They were all the same thing. You got rich by being a noble landed gentry. And that was how you had your wealth, is because you had all of these peasants working under you. And I understand how that's informed an enormous amount of sort of economic perspective from a lot of these places. The UK specifically, but I mean, realistically, you could say easily all of Europe. You can point to China. You can point to pretty much anywhere where communism really took off. Russia, the Soviet Union. All of these places had, an aristocracy that was the government and therefore had a monopoly on force. And they were therefore using that monopoly on force to extract all the wealth from the people underneath them. They essentially had, a peasant class, a serf class, a slave class. That was, we might term the working class. And that is where a lot of this, real legitimate animosity towards people that are wealthy, that are rich, comes from in most of these countries. And I totally understand it. I do totally understand it. However, it's not the reality of today. Today, the majority of people that are rich in the UK and just mostly, I would say all over the world in general, made their money. They made their money themselves, or possibly like their parents, like they're one generation removed from the founder of the business. And the reasons for that are multitudinous. First off, basically, if you have an enormous cache of money and wealth in the UK, if you die, half of that is gone. Half of that goes to the government. Like, I think it's 40%, might be more than that, and it depends on how it's structured and stuff. But a huge amount of your money just goes away when you die. Your kids don't see that. And, I mean, that seems wildly unfair to me. But, for someone who's, I don't know, less well off and isn't getting hit by that, well, they don't care. Right? If I, work and I'm successful and I'm like, hey, I'm doing this. Why? Because I want, cars and that kind of stuff. It's like, no, that stuff's empty and meaningless to me. I'm doing this because I want, my kids to be provided for. I want them to have, a nice safety net. I want them to have a comfortable life. I want them to have a secure financial future. If the state just comes in and goes, no, we're taking that. That's ours. I'm like, well, I'm dead, so I can't do anything about it. But I'm pissed leading up to it. Absolutely. The Gary's Economics idea of, the last 70 years are not normal in history. That's true, but I don't think he goes far enough into this. I don't think he delves into the historical realities of this stuff. enough. He just kind of focuses on, a little piece of it to push his message, which again is obviously resonating with a lot of people.
Country, and it's most of history in this country, and it's most of history in the US. You know, yeah, we talk about Charles Dickens. I read Hard Times. And this is written in the 19th century when Britain was like the industrial superpower of the whole world. And at the time, the government was talking about, should we tax these industrialists? And the industrialists were saying, if you tax us, we'll throw our factories into the sea. And it just...
And I understand that. I really do understand that sentiment of, you are going to put a gun to my head and say, your money that you earned, you worked, you sweated, you know exactly the amount of pain, heartache, suffering, blood, sweat, and tears that went into making this. You're not owed that. We're going to take that. We're robbing you legally via taxes of this kind of stuff. That is, yeah, I would absolutely be like, yeah, no, like, come and take it from me. Bring guns. Make it for real. Okay. Don't send some IRS auditor. Make this real. Come in with guns and take my property from me. All right. I want everyone to know that you are doing what you're actually doing. All right. And then when you get here, before you do it, I'm going to set it on fire. All right. You go to hell. You did not earn this. You did not make this. I made the world a better place by making a product that people want. You can't have it. I'll burn it to the ground. I admire that. I respect that attitude towards it. Yeah, no, you didn't earn this. This isn't yours. You go to hell.
Reminds me,
Okay, I'm just going to stop it in the middle. I think he's right, in the sense that he's saying, look, the past 70 years or something is not a normal period economically speaking. And I think that's true. Actually, the period from the 1950s to the 1970s specifically is known as the golden age of capitalism in the...
And I will say, I don't think he goes into this. They usually don't. But the reason why this was such a strange era in history in the West in general, the US, the UK, and the amount of sort of like, wealth disparity shrinks enormously. The reason for that is because so many people died in World War II. That's literally what happened. Is like, there's fewer people to eat into, the pie of like, finite resources like land and these types of things. It's like, yeah, a lot of people died, and therefore there's more to go around, and therefore the wealth divide shrinks. And that's just what happens. That seems very completely apparent and obvious to me, but I just don't see people talking about it. Does that make any sense?
The West, at least, there was a huge economic growth and then inequality actually went down. Now, that is something you just don't see that much, and I think gave a lot of hope to many people.
Yeah, and again, I'm like, you don't see it that often, I don't think, because, historically speaking, if that were to happen, a lot of people were to die, you would just create new nobility. You go, okay, this house got wiped out. All right, well, that's fine. We're going to have a knight, who did well in the war. I'm going to elevate him to be, the new Baron of, Lancaster or whatever. And therefore, they get all the land. And, there's no division of wealth, because it's just, you're just installing a new person to oversee the same amount of land. And, therefore, the wealth divide is not going to shrink. So it's kind of the first time in history of maybe then World War I, where you had a lot of other stuff going on, but where you had, a bunch of people die, and therefore, there's a lot more to go around, and ordinary people have the ability to get it because of the rise of sort of, capitalism, free market economics, and the fact that you have now, a working class, you have a middle class, you have a merchant class, you have, all of these different freedoms and ideas that are running around and allowing people to accrue wealth if they're not, born into it.
And now that's just not there anymore. We've seen economic growth, but especially in the United States and the United Kingdom, and where Gary's from, it's been very unequal, increasingly also in Europe.
And I will say here, this basically is just, look, we're back to essentially, a historical norm. It's this weird spot right here. This, it doesn't go back super far, but it's like you can easily see that this stuff, obviously, I think this only goes up to 2010, My guess is the disparity jumps a little bit more after 2020 because of COVID and that kind of stuff, which again, I blame on the government. I don't blame that on rich people. Uh, but essentially, like, yeah, you're kind of like returning to a historical norm. And that makes sense. Like you had a blip, you had a, 20-year period wherein which, an enormous amount of people in a certain generation die, are not there anymore, and therefore cannot claim or, fight for a piece of the finite wealth pie. And therefore, you have a period where, yeah, they've got a lot of stuff. They can do a lot of stuff with that. They can accrue a lot of assets that are, again, finite very easily because there's less competition for them. But then, they have a lot of kids. There's a baby boom. And then what happens? Well, okay, you return to the historical norm.
And yeah, it's true that this is going back to sort of a historical norm in the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom. It was super unequal. The United States development in the early 20th century, late 19th century was super unequal. You had these oligarch classes. This, of course, is also the case in China today, is the case in India today. In almost all emerging market economies, it's the case.
The only time we've ever really been able to provide decent living conditions for ordinary working.
Okay, and again, I do just want to just touch on this a little bit. What is decent living conditions? Decent living, if by decent living conditions you mean you're comfortable, you mean, you've got a place to live that's comfortable to live in, that is, that has some amount of luxuries, that has some amount of luxury goods, whether that's, TV, computer, all of these things that are straight up magic, like past, 20 years ago, these things were literally like unaffordable luxuries for the super elite. And going 50 years back, they were straight up sorcery. All right. Like if you had something like this, you would be burned at the stake for being a witch because this is magic. You have a brick that has all the information that's ever existed in human history at your fingertips. Yeah, that's literal witchcraft. You must be a spawn of the devil. All right. Like it's the only possible way you could get something like this. Now everybody's got it and it's no big deal. My guess is what, comfortable living conditions is very, very different from accruing wealth, because you can accrue wealth and have horrible living conditions. In fact, it helps. It helps. If you have really uncomfortable living conditions, you can save more money and therefore accrue more wealth. So what do you want? Most people, to be perfectly honest, they're very happy if they can literally just be like, yeah, I have a comfortable existence. I'm content in my day-to-day life, and that's it. And that's how people spend. That's how people spend. However much money you make, that's how much you're planning to spend. And then you'd go, all right, well, I want to not work for my entire life. So how much money do I need to save so that the last, 20, 30 years of my life where I'm not going to be working, I can just, spend that amount of money savings. That's how the vast majority of people, that's how pretty much everybody lives in terms of financially. Yeah, that's how they all live.
People was the period after the war where we massively redistributed wealth, and now we're losing that holding of wealth of the middle class.
Can you acknowledge, though, that was a completely different time as it relates to being
And this is a good point.
able to...
It was a different time, but, I could,
Because of technology.
Nigeria today, Brazil today, the UK 300 years ago, France 200 years ago. There is only one specific time that we have ever successfully provided broad living standards for ordinary people, and it was a period of time where we protected a broadly equal wealth distribution.
And tax the rich at very high rates is what he's going to say. Now, that is one thing that happened during that period of time, is that, you tax the rich at very high rates. Yeah, that happened. That happened. However, we can also say that, you tax the rich at very high rates. If wealth distribution is less unequal, that also means that they probably weren't paying as much in taxes. And again, I think they're going to go into this, but the reasons why they could tax them at these high rates is not there anymore. It's not possible. And again, this is also, it's oversimplifying things, because it's entirely possible that the fact that, the rich were taxed at very high rates had super small effect on the amount of, wealth redistribution. It's entirely possible. So, I mean, again, like I have another explanation for why the wealth distribution was more equal after the war. It's because, there were less people around fighting for those resources. I mean, that's just as reasonable as going, okay, it's because of taxes. It's like, I think mine's actually a little fundamentally easier to understand.
And tax the rich at very high rates.
Okay, technologically speaking, it's much easier today to move money across the world
This is true.
than it was in the golden age of capitalism. And that is true. Yes, you had super high taxes in the United States, United Kingdom, for top earners in that time period. But that's not the only thing that defined or made the golden age of capitalism very different than most other times. Because in this time you had huge or super stringent capital controls, meaning you could not move money across borders that easily. And today you can, and also in the time period that Gary mentions with the rubber bands and
this is also a time of like way less globalization. If you were, a rich industrialist or a rich, robber baron, whatever, in the UK or the US or something like that, essentially all of your business was done in the US. As it is right now, that's almost never the case. If you are a super rich person, you've probably got businesses in multiple different countries. You have like a transnational corporation. And therefore, you're just always shopping around for the best deal. And you're not only, in terms of, your own tax rates, but in terms of, the taxes of how everything is going to be set up, where you're putting your factories, where you're putting your businesses, where your employees are working, all of those types of things. You're shopping around for that. And yeah, it's much easier to move it around now.
the United States, with these oligarchs in the United Kingdom, money could move across borders super easily. This was a time of hyper-globalization back then, and it is today again as well. And this is really the problem with the high taxes, with super high taxes. And we are seeing it now in the United Kingdom, that a lot of millionaires or very rich people are leaving the United
Yeah, it's basically, I think they have per capita lost the most amount of millionaires out of everybody. So, I mean, again, we've got another video that we're going to be looking at later, but something along the lines of, let's say the top 1% of people earn about 14% of all the revenue in the UK. They pay 30% of the taxes. Okay, well, guess what? If you're losing more of those people, you're losing how much more of, the tax base, how much of the services that you want to provide are now going to be completely unaffordable because you've kicked out, you've made it unappealing to live in the UK to a couple, millionaires. And again, the majority of those people that are rich, not even necessarily super rich, but, just millionaires, are absolutely just, people that have made it themselves. I mean, it's not unheard of in the US to be like, I've got like a successful plumbing business. I'm a millionaire. I'm a successful contractor. I'm a millionaire. It's not hundreds of millions of dollars or anything like that, but yeah, like you're a millionaire. Okay. Is that insane to be like, yeah, you know what? I don't want to be taxed to the point where I can't run my business anymore. I'd rather go somewhere else.
Kingdom. We have seen it, I think, in Norway as well, that they were increasing taxes there, and then just a lot of the people that were supposed to pay those taxes left to Switzerland in the case of Norway. And the problem is that you can easily do business across borders, so you can just keep your business in Norway and live in Switzerland and pay most of your taxes in Switzerland, which are much lower than in Norway. So I think what Gary says is mostly correct, but the host is also making a good point. There is a reason why we don't have those higher taxes at the moment today. You can say, look, that's morally unacceptable. Absolutely, that's a political point, but there is a reason it's more difficult to do that today, and that is the mobility of capital today is just so much higher that people can easily move somewhere, or just have their money move somewhere else such that they pay lower taxes today.
Yeah, and I mean, this is my point, which is if the solution to your problem, wealth inequality, and wealth inequality is going to necessarily lead to some economic collapse, if your solution to it is just practically impossible, we want to tax the super rich. Okay, How are we going to get them to do that? Are you gonna like lock them down and just liquidate all of their wealth? And they can't move it. They can't move it around. They can't do any of this kind of stuff. Okay, great. Let's say that you do that. Again, what does that actually accomplish? In terms of like short-term stuff, yeah, you get a little bit of a bump, but it's like almost nothing. And then those people, you can't hit them again for all of their wealth. It's gone. You've sucked it all dry. And all the people that you weren't able to grab in your initial lockdown are gone. They're like, no, we're leaving. We're not taking any of this stuff. I don't think it's a reasonable proposal if the possibility of it succeeding is almost nil, and you're utilizing all of this attention, resource, capital to, grab up all these people. You're wasting everybody's time. If the solution you're proposing is totally impractical and almost certainly not going to work, and it's just completely unfit for the current situation, you're wasting everybody's time for this, just completely flippant reason of I'd like to do this thing. That's great, man. I love that you want to do that, but if that's your policy proposal, it needs to have some possibility of success. Otherwise, you're just grifting. You're just trying to make, a name for yourself.
That's a problem. So my producers told me that in the UK there's this initiative that Gary supports, Tax the Super Rich, and it does take into account that people should continue to pay taxes even if they live elsewhere, but they earn their money in the United Kingdom. And that could be possible.
That is, that's done in the US. That's absolutely done in the US. So it's entirely possible that they would do that. But again, let's look at the US. What are you going to do if, someone in the US wants to go, all right, well, we're going to, I'm going to leave. I'm going to be a tax non-resident. And, there's lots of schemes and ways that people get away with it. But a lot of people will literally just be like, yeah, no, like I'm just fine with not being a US citizen anymore. Like, yeah, screw you. You're going to put a gun to my head and say, I'm going to take all of your money away because, like I don't earn any of this money in the States. I'll just not be a US citizen. All right. Like, that's fine. And if the UK wants to do this, that's great. They have to go through the entire process of doing it. But again, if that's going to happen, well, guess what? All of those people that are living in the UK, and a lot of them, have moved to the UK and have companies and things elsewhere, well, they're just not going to come to the UK anymore. It's just, again, I'm like, I understand some of the points that Gary makes, and I think some of them are kind of reasonable in terms of, attempting to make it less attractive to hoard wealth in the realm of finite resources like land and property. That's kind of reasonable. That's kind of a semi-reasonable economic proposal. But I do feel that he does himself a disservice by always oversimplifying it when he's on other platforms and says, tax the rich. It's like, no. I think that is what he means. And to be honest, I think that is what he means because he's trying to, build some sort of like, fame and influence for himself. I honestly do think that is his goal. Maybe he's got a great end goal after he gets 10 million, 100 million subscribers. But my guess is he kind of just wants that influence, which is fine. I don't have a problem with that. Somebody going after, fame and, wealth. That's fine. I don't have a problem with it. But it does mean that, I can't really take him seriously in terms of his economic proposals because they do seem empty. They do seem like, they seem like a grift. I hate to say it because I think this guy is being like genuine. It's just that he's kind of genuine because he's convinced himself that he is the Messiah. And that's not, I don't like that. It's not a good deal for me. So, I do worry about that kind of stuff because the proposals that he's making, when he does make them, some of them have some value, but the general like theme that he's going for is very much like a communist, eat the rich, the rich don't deserve their money. You know, we should French Revolution them. We should be doing all kinds of super crazy stuff. And again, the proposals that he has, the way he frames them, in that they're such a losing battle. The only way you could actually implement any of these policies is to utilize an enormous amount of, like force. And by force, I mean like legit like violence to achieve them. And we've seen that before. It doesn't work. The wealth redistribution doesn't work. It just, ends up, okay, instead of it's in the hands of, the rich, the capitalist bourgeoisie, factory owners that, built their factories out of their blood, sweat, and tears. Now it goes to the state. And it goes into, nepotism. It goes into, hey, who are my, government lackeys and cronies? That's the people that get rich. Right? You see that in China. You see that in the Soviet Union. It's just, all right, instead of it's, we're redistributing the rich people's assets amongst all the poor, working class, middle class people. No, it all goes to the state. And now the state is the super rich elite. And you're basically just returning to the aristocracy. You're just calling it something slightly different. Instead of it being, hey, this is the Duke, he's the Commissar of Commerce. It's just, you're kind of missing the point here. I don't see this as being a viable way in which to get the ends that you're hoping for. So that's kind of that's still my issue with Gary's economics, I'll say. And I think Macro here, Marco, whatever his name is, I think he makes some good points here in terms of the non-feasibility of this, just because of the current market conditions do not allow for taxing the rich well. It's just not a viable plan. But let me know what you think. Let me know in the comments. Tell me how I'm wrong. And then also let me know if you could even see this video, because some of these videos are disappearing on YouTube, restricted mode, especially if you're in the UK. I would imagine that because of your government's fantastic new dox yourself policy, you probably are not seeing these videos as much. Let me know in the comments if that's true. Good luck in all your endeavors. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I really do appreciate it. And I'll say farewell for now.